So a very warm welcome to everyone who has joined from different parts of the world, maybe in different time zones. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, hopefully not good night. This is Arko Chattopadhyay. I teach in the humanities and social sciences in IIT Gandhinagar. And we have Angel here, Angel Maria Varghese, who's co-organizing this seminar series. She is a fresh graduate from Humanities and Social Sciences, our MA program in Society and Culture, and she's currently working here as Sabarmati Bridge Fellow. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Krista Quesenberry with us today, who's going to talk about graphic memoirs, something that is very specifically interesting within the sort of medical humanities cluster if we think about graphic medicine. And of course, as you would know from the title of the talk, she'll be talking about medical questions in the graphic memoir, especially questions around medical terminology and identification. Just to very briefly contextualize this seminar series, this is the 13th talk, and we have now more or less gone into the second half of our third semester. It started a couple of semesters back. And to take you back to that, this colloquy initiated by HSS, Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, is meant to open up dialogues between medicine, humanities, and literary and cultural studies by dwelling on their intersections that operate in the cultural field of medicine. The seminar series encourages discussions on trauma, suffering, loss, grief, recovery, coping mechanisms, transformed identities, and so on. The presentations will and have covered, in fact, various subdisciplines within the rubric of medical humanities, such as medical theater. In fact, we had the first talk on that, medical sociology, clinical anthropology, psychoanalysis, and medical literature, and also clinical communication, narrative medicine. The talks conducted by the respective field experts and leaders will encounter and accentuate the granular details of clinical communication, clinical care spaces, familial care, written and oral narratives of the patients, etc., that seldom get highlighted in the data-oriented clinical case studies. So this is just a background detailing for the series, and let me now request Angel to formally introduce Krista. Krista, very warm welcome here, and I'm very happy that you could make it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. To formally introduce Dr. Krista Quesenberry. Dr. Krista Quesenberry is an assistant professor of English at Albion College, where she teaches professional and technical writing, as well as journalism. She received her dual title Ph.D. in English and Women's Studies in 2016 from Pennsylvania State University. Krista's recent work on comics, identity, and life writing appears in the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, Life Writing, and More Critical Approaches to Comics, Theories and Methods, which was published in 2019 by Routledge. Thank you for joining us, Professor Krista. It's such a joy to have you here today.
Thank you so much, everybody who's here, for joining us from across the world. And thank you, Arko and Angel, for inviting me, for making all the arrangements. You've done so much wonderful work to make this talk happen. I am deeply, deeply honored to be here. So thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly get our screen sharing going here.
Yeah, it's up there.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is the talk I hope you have planned to be here for: Carousels and Dead Fish, Identification with and Self-Identification with and Against Medical Terminology in Graphic Memoirs, as was introduced. I am Krista Quesenberry, and I am not, there we go. I have four very, very brief announcements or notes before we really dig in to begin. The first is that I do have an accessibility copy available for those who might want to follow along. I promise it will not be a perfect transcript because I will divert. I will say things that are not already in the script, but I do like to make an accessibility copy available to those who might benefit from having a copy in front of them. So that is available. I only ask that you please not quote from it or work with it. It is a work in progress, like everything I am presenting here today. I'm still thinking about these ideas. I hope you'll help me think through them here. I hope you'll think through them with me here today. So I'm still working on them. I hope that you will respect that it is a work in progress. Please don't quote from it, but feel free to reach out to me if you have thoughts or questions. If this talk sparks anything for you, I'm happy to chat with you further. But please treat this as an accessibility copy if you do access it. Throughout the talk on a similar note, I'm going to take a couple of pauses for questions and answers. Arco and Angel and I were just talking about just how much time we've all been spending on Zoom and in hybrid meetings and all of that. And I just want to take a few moments throughout the talk, since it is a little bit of a longer session, to give you a moment to ask any sort of urgent questions. If there's a question that is a clarification question, or if sometimes I get excited and I get to talking fast. I get to speak a little bit quickly. So if I say something that didn't quite come through, or if I zoomed past an idea that didn't quite land for you, and you just want to ask a quick clarification question that would be better now than waiting until the end when we have a Q&A opening, I'm happy to address that along the way. But those quick Q&A pauses are a good moment to just kind of let your jaw rest, move your eyes around, run and grab a drink if you need to. They're a moment to give your body and your mind a little bit of a break. So I will signal those Q&A pauses for you just a couple of times throughout the beginning of the talk before we get to the Q&A at the end. Relatedly, I do need to make a content warning. There's discussion of depression, bipolar disorder, and mental health in general throughout the talk. So if those are challenging issues for you, similarly, just please feel free to take whatever you need throughout this period of time that we're together. I do want this to be an open exchange of ideas, and I believe and I understand that can only happen if we are all able to be comfortable and be wholly within ourselves when we are together. So whatever you need to make that happen, if that's to leave and come back, or whatever you need to take a break to attend to your body and to your mind and your heart in whatever ways you need to, I hope that you will do that throughout this time so that we can be here together for the time that we have. Lastly, I just want to note that I will be reading my talk here today. That tends to be the norm in my field of English literary studies. We tend to read, we literary scholars think that we are better in writing than speaking. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure, but we think we are. I tend to ramble a bit and get off track. So to keep from talking long into the wee hours of the morning for you, I will stick to my script. But like I said, I'll have those pauses in case anybody needs to ask anything very quickly. So those are my quick notes. Now I think we can get started in earnest. Trying to figure out which things it wants me to click. Okay, so as Angel mentioned, thank you so much for that intro, Angel. I am Krista Quesenberry. I teach at Albion College in Albion, Michigan in the USA, which you can probably already tell from my accent that I'm from the Midwest in the USA. This is what Albion looks like more of the year, of the academic year. And then this is the building I teach in. It's a really beautiful campus. This little rock outside the front, students will spray paint every year. And I really, really love my job because I get to do many, many things, as Angel mentioned. I do teach professional and technical writing, and at my school, that means I get to teach journalism and I get to advise the student newspaper. But in my literature, or in my research, I study American literature of the 20th and 21st century. And like Angel said, I studied English, and I studied women's gender and sexuality studies at Penn State University. I've actually been involved for more than 10 years in the Cambridge University publication of Ernest Hemingway's letters. And I'm currently working on some archival projects on two of his contemporaries, women that I don't think we talk about enough, Margaret Anderson and Kay Boyle. So those are projects I work on. And at the same time, I'm juggling projects in graphic medicine, namely, as Arco and Angel mentioned, namely on projects about graphic medicine, comics memoirs about illness, disease, and disability. And I'm really lucky. I'm lucky to work in a place like this where I get to explore and expand my ideas in all of these interests. But the real central core of my work, what I'm really passionate and excited about, is writing it's the writing that people do when they are writing about their everyday lives and their everyday experiences, and especially the challenges that they face that they don't think other people are inclined to understand. So I think a lot about power and privilege as they are conveyed in folks' life narratives. They're writing about their own lives, whether I'm talking to students about writing difficult emails, or I'm looking at the memoirs of a doctor or a patient talking about working in graphic, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. Doctors and patients talking about their experiences of cancer, say, or some other medical condition. So I promised I would talk a little bit about graphic medicine, and that's the background that I come to this talk from. For those of you who maybe haven't heard about graphic medicine or don't know much about it, I wanted to talk a little about the field. I feel like every time I need to advance a slide, it wants a different command, a different type of click. So I apologize, it's taking me a minute. I will get it right just before the talk is over. So graphic medicine is a field of study. It's a community. It's a conference. It's a website. It's an archive of primary text. It's so many things. It's a catch-all term, kind of, in some ways, for work that explores the interaction, in this case it's intersection, elsewhere Ian calls it the interaction between the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. This language is language that I borrow from the graphic medicine website. You see that URL down there, graphicmedicine.org. It's run currently by MK Zerwick and Ian Williams, whose avatar is there. He's depicting himself there. He coined the term in 2007. And many of the folks who work in graphic medicine are like me, they're just mere academics. All we do is we study graphic narratives, we examine their unique attributes. Some folks who work in graphic medicine emerge from the medical humanities, work in medical schools, others emerge from literary studies, narrative medicine, narrative studies, that kind of realm. Some of us arrive at graphic medicine through comic studies, right? So there are many kinds of inroads through different literary and humanities fields to arrive in the academic study of graphic medicine. But what's most exciting to me about this field is that actually many folks who work in graphic medicine aren't really academics at all, or they don't see themselves as academics at all. They do very intellectual academic work, but they don't see themselves as academics at all. They are comics artists and authors. They are practitioners of comics. They are creators and storytellers. Their contributions actively shape our scholarship, while our scholarship can sometimes shape their work. It's this collaborative interaction that happens in the space of graphic medicine, whether that's through publications, at the conference, things like that. I'm just going to take a quick sip. And then beyond that, many folks who work in graphic medicine are also, in addition or otherwise, are medical professionals. So they're practitioners of medicine. They might be doctors, nurses, aides, caretakers of all kinds, maybe educational professionals in the medical field. A striking number of colleagues in the graphic medicine field are actually all three, including MK and Ian, who run the website. So MK is a nurse, Ian's a doctor. They sort of make comics, they practice medicine or have practiced medicine. Sometimes they're educators, they write scholarship, they do all of these things at once. And so I think that is what's so important, impressive, and cool about graphic medicine as a subset of literary studies, a subset of the medical humanities, as this kind of cross-disciplinary interactive space. Is that the scholars who show up here, the people, the practitioners, the folks who show up in the room on a graphic medicine day at a graphic medicine conversation are super active, enthusiastic, and their work is very complementary in the sense of completing each other's missions, right? So in my experience, we sort of understand that these three branches or these three components are very helpful to one another, and we couldn't exist without each other. So it's a very supportive, cooperative academic community. And the other thing about this field and its name, this kind of dual situation happening, graphic and medicine, that's super relevant to this talk, is that that graphic medicine engages across the many perspectives of healthcare and healthcare narratives in particular. So graphic narratives could come from the point of view of like a doctor or a nurse, but they could also, and they very often do, come from the point of view of a patient or a patient's family member, sometimes a caretaker who's not involved in either of those groups. Increasingly, comics are coming from the points of view of workers in healthcare related fields like insurance or emergency services or medical research. So this is just a very, very random smattering of examples from this NIH exhibition. There have been lots of exhibitions like this that try to capture and make sense of what is graphic medicine, what is the scope, what is the scale of it, what are its boundaries. I don't know that they were answering the question of what are its boundaries, but the more you try to define it, the more unwieldy it becomes because it just keeps expanding, right? So it's a pretty new field. Again, the term was coined in 2007. It's a pretty new field and things keep getting roped and looped into it, which is really fun and exciting, right? It makes for good literary scholarship because you continue to have more to look at, more to work on. So in graphic narratives, these different viewpoints, these ideas from different perspectives might interact, they might mingle, they might influence each other. And what I find really interesting and important here, again, the wide range here is that all of these experiences, they are embodied experiences, they are emoted experiences, they are sometimes remembered, even at times imagined experiences, many times have no register in medical discourse or something like a patient chart. These are the kinds of experiences that don't get recorded elsewhere. So what graphic medicine does is it brings voice and space to medical care experiences that may not have recognition elsewhere. So that's all very exciting. For me, that's kind of the outline of a lot of what in the work is exciting to me. I'll just, because many times in a talk like this, folks are interested in works cited or reference kind of lineages and pathways. I'll just highlight a few of the folks whose work influences mine. So I'm obviously very, very influenced by the work of one of my mentors, Susan Squire, whom I was so lucky to have as my dissertation advisor. Although I don't think I had a single comic in my dissertation, but anyway, I worked closely with her and she obviously influenced my thinking on this field quite a bit. So I draw a lot on her work and the work of her co-authors for the Graphic Medicine Manifesto. I've already mentioned Zerwick and Williams, Michael Green, Kimberly Myers, and Scott Smith also co-wrote that book. Elizabeth El Rafai, Hilary Shute, and Tanir Oxman also have really influenced my thinking in this field quite a bit. On the narrative side of things, outside of comics, I draw on work by Rita Sharon, Arthur Frank, Lee Gilmore, and Tom Kauser. And I always learn something new every single time I return to the essay by Virginia Woolf on being ill. So there's obviously more in my critical lineage, but those are just a few names and stars in the constellation that bring me to where I'm at in terms of graphic medicine, folks to whom I'm indebted. So like I said, I will pause now just briefly if there are any quick questions or clarifications that I can address at this exact moment. Otherwise, just take this for a rest to your brain. Take it as a moment to relax your eyes, relax your head. I'll go ahead and take a drink and see if there are any questions. All right. If you're still taking a break, that's perfectly fine. I will go ahead and move into seeing no questions, I will go ahead and move into the more detailed argument part of the talk. I'll just give folks another second to get their break brains going. All right. So I do have a few blank slides. If you're seeing nothing on the screen, you're seeing exactly what you're supposed to be seeing. In my current work, I am thinking about the interplay of generic discourses, iconographies, and narrative patterns as they relate to idiosyncratic personal self-representations. So I believe that identification, though not universal, comes out of a personal response to a generalized pattern. So I'll say that again, a personalized response to a generalized pattern. This image, this panel may be familiar to some of you. In 1993, Scott McCloud circulated the idea of the universality of cartoon imagery. He wrote that the more cartoony a face is, for instance, the more people it could be said to describe. He explains that this is a function of both amplification through simplification and universal identification. In other words, we connect more with the smiley face icon on the far right. It should be, I hope it's on the far right of your screen, but that smiley face icon, we connect more with that icon than we do with the Dick Tracy-faced gentleman on the far left, no matter how handsome he may be, no matter how much we may want to look like him. In McCloud's theory, we connect more with that smiley face because of the simplisticness and the generalizability of his features. McCloud goes so far as to suggest that you might not even read his book, Understanding Comics, if you didn't recognize yourself in his avatar. Now, I've written about the racial and gender presumptions of McCloud's simple formula, considering that we may actually just have to begin with a young white man in order to go through this progression and arrive where McCloud does at this idea of a universalized image. That the simplification move may produce different results if we begin with a different original image. Oh, sorry, I meant to show you a little bit more of McCloud's idea about the specific details. But what I have to say about this is that if we were to consider a revision of McCloud's schema, starting with the baseline of this white male character and ending with a smiley face, makes for a linear and clear progression from specific to generic identities. But would this exercise work as well if the initial photorealistic image were a Black woman, an elderly Latino man, a drag queen, a girl who has paraplegia, a boy with Down syndrome? In that challenge, which I've written about elsewhere, I worry that the assumption that the simpler avatars, the smiley faces, correlate to more people, that idea reinforces normativity in visual perceptions of majority and minority identities, at the same time as McCloud's argument seems to encourage artists to aim for the more universal. He seems to be encouraging us to aim for that more sort of simplified and universal image, when to me, what seems to have more power in comics over and over again in the comics that I read is how the most minute and idiosyncratic and even unique seeming experiences are actually a lot more universal than we realize, a lot more universal than they may at first seem. So by prioritizing the universality of the smiley face guy, the smiley face icon, we lose the opportunity to produce a common experience around something more interesting, more unique, and more fully human out of the specificity on the other side of this chart. So I obviously have some reservations about accepting the schema without qualification, but I do still find this idea of the universal identification helpful, in that it comes out of an argument that simplification is a factor in self-recognition. And by simplification, I mean paring the thing down to its most basic parts. And by self-recognition, I mean connecting the visual experience with the viewer's own identity. So through the process of simplification, we do have this experience of connecting the visual with the viewer's self-identity. And that is, so what I'm saying here is that I do disagree with McCloud's kind of notion in general here, that the more simple avatar is in the absolute simplest form is the highest form of self-identification we can achieve, and that there's no limit to simplification and self-identification. But instead, what I think is probably more true is that there's a sliding scale, or maybe like a bell curve, where at the further extremes, we lose the potential for self-recognition, or we lose some of it. I do agree with McCloud that there's a functional interplay between drawing that is generic and drawing that is specific, but instead of aiming for the ultimate lack of specificity, I think the highest level of self-identification, self-recognition comes when there is some amount of trade-off between the simplification and the specificity, a kind of sweet spot where identity can form and be crystallized, where one can see oneself not as wholly unique without as a wholly unique individual, unlike anybody else, as the photorealistic figure on the far left, but also not like one of many others with, that no distinguishing features, like on the far right. So this is not my bell curve. These are not my terms. I just thought it was actually kind of funny that the language of deficiency and this was just a Creative Commons licensed public domain image, but I thought deficiency and toxicity actually mapped really well on here. So the citation is down there, but the idea of, on one end and the other end, we may lose some of that potential. At the optimal may be somewhere in the middle. This is not an exact visual representation of what I'm articulating, but the idea is that it takes an interplay between general and specific, which can be achieved through many strategies, right? It's not only this center piece of MacLeod's chart, but it can be achieved through many strategies to produce a moment of self-recognition between the comics avatar and the comics reader. So moving on from MacLeod, Ian Williams has gone a bit further than MacLeod with his beautifully articulated concept of the self-picturing of suffering. I love that. Are we good? I'm gonna go ahead and, there we go. The self-picturing of suffering, I love that term. It's such a beautiful term, the self-picturing of suffering. Or he also calls it the iconography of illness, which is very useful and productive. So he writes in the Graphic Medicine Manifesto that iconographic representations of health, illness, and disease help construct the illness stereotypes that influence the way in which a condition is viewed by others, as well as the patient's experience of the condition. And furthermore, that iconographies were traditionally the domain of the doctors or medical artists who wielded power by controlling and standardizing the way that diseases were visualized. But graphic medicine, in this panel on the side, seeks to disrupt that power imbalance. Yay! Because those best positioned to represent illness and caregiving are those living with it. Indeed, Williams explains that by constructing new visual styles of suffering and illness, comics artists might be subtly altering the discourse of health and the social mediation of illness outside the clinic. I think that's so important. So by constructing new visual styles of suffering and illness, the authors of graphic pathographies may be subtly altering the discourse of health and the social mediation of illness outside the clinic. In the way that Williams frames it, the major power and promise of medical comics is to highlight the individual experience so that those personal narratives can dominate the available conversations about health and well-being, rather than the normative, generalizable, sterilized medical discourses. But Williams's focus is on the representations of illness itself, the attacking aliens of the infection or the cellular takeover of an HIV or cancer cell. The manifestations of illness in the body and on the body, that's what Williams is taking up. And I agree with Williams 100%, but I also think there is something to be said about the role of the generalizable in that process. There is something that goes beyond the availability of more diverse and diverse and innovative imagery. So I want to take another quick pause. The next, oh, just kidding. I don't want to take a quick pause. I want to say one more thing and then we'll take a quick pause. So I'm thinking about this generalization move that MacLeod is making and the personalization move that Williams is making. And what I'm finding in graphic memoirs about health and illness, particularly those centered on mental and emotional conditions. Again, unlike, in the work that I was quoting, Williams is focused mostly on physical conditions, not entirely, but in that work. What I'm finding is that the language of the medical establishment is also important to autobiographical comics artists' self-recognition and self-awareness. Indeed, it seems to me that authors negotiate and make space for their identities within illness through a combination of the personal, singular, particular, day-to-day experiences of illness that are patient-described in the way Williams celebrates, along with the validation, precision, and generalization of medical terminology, which functions similar to creating a cartoony diagnosis that can be projected onto patients. This interaction of the universalized and the particular is where we actually arrive at some sort of identity formation or the ability to develop such an identity within illness or disability. So with that, we're going to take a pause. For the rest of the paper, I'm going to look at 2 examples. We have about 15 minutes left to look at 2 examples. So if you have any quick clarification questions, I'm happy to field them, or we can just take a moment to rest, take a pause, and before we continue. I'm not seeing any questions. I know it helps me just to shift a little bit, blink my eyes a little bit. All right. So in this last section of the paper, I will talk about two texts. This is Ellen Forney's graphic memoir, Marbles, Mania, Depression, Michelangelo, and Me, where she gives us the carousels from the talk's title, and Ali Broche's Hyperbole and a Half, which was a webcomic series on depression, and then she eventually published it as part of her first book, and that's where we get the dead fish of the talk's title. For those of you who don't know these comics, they are fantastic. I'm just scratching the surface. They are brilliant. They are applicable. They teach amazingly. Students love them if you're a teacher. And they've both received a good amount of critical attention. They're both from 2013. The Hyperbole and a Half book was published in print in 2013, but it was online much before that. So they've been around a while, and there's a lot of critical attention to them. So if you haven't read them before, they're worth taking a look at, and there's a lot of conversation out there on them comparatively in comic studies. So Ali Broche's, I'm going to start on the left side. I'm going to start with Ali Broche's Adventures in Depression and Depression Part 2. This 2-part comic grapples with the impersonal definitions of depression that do not come from medical discourse exactly, but from the pop culture version of medical concepts. That is to say, Broche is establishing her identity with and against a common cultural sense of depression that is vaguely medical and impersonal, but is not the kind of establishment authorizing language that Williams refers to. In the first of her 2 depression comics, Broche identifies herself in the opening sentence as a person with depression. But then, so right from the outset, she is thinking of herself as within a community, and she's naming her condition using medical terms, the medical term of depression. But Broche immediately morphs from depression into this term of sadness, which is not as clinical of a term, and it works to generalize her experience from a medical condition to an experienced symptom. In the second installment of the series, she actually even further disarticulates sadness from an emotion she calls from sadness to crying. Broche is drawing on a generalized sense of what depression is without citation or depiction of a clinical setting or even clinical tools. Instead, in her comic, she's anticipating that there's a familiarity with these terms for the reader, and she's using the terms to add clarity and authority to the narrative, as well as to situate her experience within the larger cultural conversation about mental and emotional illness and health. One of the most memorable and quotable moments in Broche's Depression Part 2, the second installment, is a scene in which Broche is trying to demonstrate why the helpful, the helpful responses of non-depressed people are not producing their anticipated reactions when she discloses her identity as a person with depression. And I'm just going to read this section here because it's so good. So this is Broche's narration. She sort of types it out on her website. She just types it out in this plain text. So Broche's narration says, and that's the most frustrating thing about depression. It isn't always something you can fight back against with hope. It isn't even something, it's nothing. And you can't combat nothing. You can't fill it up. You can't cover it. It's just there, pulling the meaning out of everything. That being the case, all the hopeful, proactive solutions start to sound completely insane in contrast to the scope of the problem. It would be like having a bunch of dead fish but no one around you will acknowledge that the fish are dead. Instead, they offer to help you look for the fish or try to help you figure out why they disappeared. So then in this panel, this woman is saying, what's wrong? And we get Broche's avatar. This is Broche herself. This is her self-identification. This is her avatar. She's holding these handfuls of goldfish, and she says, my fish are dead. And the woman says, don't worry, I'll help you find them. Are there any clues where they went? And Broche says, I know where they are. The problem is that they aren't alive anymore. And the woman says, let's keep looking. I'm sure they'll turn up somewhere. And Broche says, no, see, that solution is for a different problem than the one I have. And then the narration continues, the problem may not even have a solution, but you aren't necessarily looking for solutions. You're maybe just looking for someone to say, sorry about how dead your fish are, or wow, those are super dead. I still like you though. And then these next two panels, I've kind of squashed them together, but there are a bunch of folks. They look really kind. Most of them are smiling. They're trying to encourage. They say things like, fish are always deadest before the dawn. And you used to have so many fish. What happened? And we should get together this weekend and make fun little finger puppets out of them. And have you tried feeding them? And what about bees? Do you like bees? And why not just make them be alive again? And then back to Broche's avatar, who is now throwing the dead fish at these people who are trying to help. She says, why can't anyone see how dead these are? And if you can see it down at the bottom, the narration comes back in and she says, I started spending more time alone. And I find that line kind of heartbreaking, because that's obviously in many cases, one of the worst things that can happen. To be pushed away and to feel lonely at that point is not probably what she was hoping for. So I mean, this series, I hope the humor comes through. I hope you find it hilarious. I find it hilarious. And for anybody who's been like pelted with platitudes in the same way, on their mental health journey, like it's just so real. And yet it's about dead fish. So there's no like generalized, universalized, normalized medium space here in the dead fish metaphor. There's no clinical language, yet it's one of the major pieces that her throngs of fans really relate to. And this is one of the scenes that circulates and works its way into conversation about this comic. And people talk about this outside of the comic. People have seen this scene or the series of panels even outside of this comic. When you see comments at the bottom of Broche's website, there's a flood of appreciation for her work, for people who feel seen by her stories, and who appreciate her resistance to some of the common cultural representations of sadness and depression. So I'll post a couple here without reading them, but you can kind of see in these comments that folks are just saying, this really speaks to me. You made me understand this so much better. You've said this so much better than I could. And what I'm really struck by here is that her readers can't really even express what she has articulated for them. They don't even have words for it themselves. But she has given them language or visuals for a thing that they were trying to articulate. And I think that that's incredibly powerful. So Broche, I think here is deftly balancing the generalizability of those platitudes and the common experience of these kinds of responses with the specificity and the shock value of the dead fish metaphor. Because of the specificity and the uniqueness of that, along with the generalizability and the commonness of those platitudes, she ends up in this kind of middle space where people are really seeing themselves in it. They're really making a connection. Lots and lots of folks have talked about, this is what you're not supposed to say to somebody who tells you they're depressed. These are the kinds of comments that don't really help. And that language or that training doesn't land, but somehow Broche's dead fish metaphor really does. And I think it's this combination of the defamiliar and the familiar, right? There are lots of language theories that cover this, but the specificity and the generic, or the surprising along with the familiar. I would also argue from a comics perspective that the fact that the dead fish are so cute in her hands and she ends up throwing them at the end, I think that's a specific asset to the argument too. If it were photorealistic, if it were a photorealistic depiction of dead fish, it would not have the same charm. So it's really important that she's got these really cute little goldfish in her hand. And I think in words, it wouldn't have the same impact either. So it really has a lot to do for me with Broche's very rough and playful artistic style, her irreverent humor, and then the delicate balance of those things with the unique facets of the broad generalizable diagnosis of depression and the depression experience, and how that makes for a kind of deep self-recognition among her readers. I'm skipping a little bit through a few pieces because I'm watching the time and I want to be sure we have time for Q&A at the end, but primarily I think it's really important too that depression is one of the more commonly diagnosed illnesses. And so the prevalence and the wide experiences of depression, I think that is also worth noting, that the wide swaths of folks who experience depression have the opportunity to tap into that self-recognition, means that Broche doesn't have to maybe work as hard at that balance, because there are so many people that have the generalizable experience, so her specificity can speak to them in unique ways. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you'd like. So I will move on to Ellen Forney's graphic memoir about her diagnosis and early years after diagnosis, living with bipolar disorder, or manic depression as it's called. And unlike Broche, Forney's experience is primarily in relation to the medical establishment. So I talked about Broche's comic not really happening in clinical spaces, not really engaging with that medical language except at the very beginning to kind of establish the condition. But for Forney, she receives her diagnosis at the time, within the time frame of the memoir happening, and she resists it. She further resists some of its common treatments, and she eventually wiggles her way back into treatment, a treatment regimen that works for her. And then also there's the fact, like I was just saying about depression, that bipolar disorder is less commonly diagnosed, right? So there's something that Forney is pushing back against. Forney is working to she's talking about a condition that has less of a personality in the popular imagination, and is less understood in the popular imagination than depression. So this scene is from the beginning of the memoir, where we see Forney introduced. She's in the throes of a manic episode. She's like imagining this tattoo, getting a tattoo, kissing the tattoo artist. She's having this great time. She's, it's kind of overwhelming to the reader. When I teach it to students, they're like, whoa. But she sees it as very like romantic, exciting, and fun. And then it's kind of an abrupt shift from this very open and loose page format of the panels, and then to this rigid kind of traditional comic structure, where she's in her therapist's office and she's undergoing treatment, right? And so we learn that at this point, her feeling of being jazzed, her therapist is now starting to call bipolar disorder. So she's having her language not policed, but kind of shifted and pushed in a certain direction to be more medicalized. And at first, Forney resists this. She says, my mother and I have bipolar tendencies, but I'm not like bipolar. She's acknowledging the symptoms, but she's resisting the stigma of the condition, and she's resisting making that her identity. And she doesn't want to give up her quirkiness and the personality attributes that she attributes. She doesn't want those things that are symptoms of a condition to be taken away from her as parts of her personality. So what I really appreciate about the next couple of pages, this series of panels on the next few pages, is that Forney actually runs through the symptoms of bipolar disorder in the DSM, and she personalizes each of these terms, the medical terminology. She does essentially what Williams talks about. She reads the decreased need for sleep, and then she imagines her own experience of that. She reads the flight of ideas, or the subjective experience that thoughts are racing, and she gives us a repeat of this visual she has given us before of her mind kind of moving in this incredibly fast way. This is an echo of a visual that's happened already in the memoir. And it's just this really powerful moment of doing the thing Williams is talking about, of saying, here's the medical language, here's that generalizable, broadly applicable medical language, and then here's Forney's experience of it. Here's Forney's visual and verbal personal experience of that. And I really appreciate that Forney is one of the few comics artists who really directly walks through that process of negotiating her own resistance to the medical terminology of diagnosis, while also like providing her own her own version. And then here we see sort of her grappling with that. And I love the DSM reference here at the bottom where she's labeled, she looks like a prison inmate with her, placard there. So I'll give you this last image from her memoir as a way to kind of wrap things up, and I'll skip my conclusion. So this is the carousel from the title. As Forney begins to understand her bipolar disorder and her place within it, she lands on a metaphor of the carousel, delivering this page, this kind of splash page. It's a large image with no bounding box. And we sort of see, if we zoom in on this, we can kind of see a lot of details of the concept of manic depression or bipolar disorder. The popular understanding is, highs and lows or swinging back and forth. And in this visual metaphor, Forney is drawing on the existing understanding of a carousel, right? Of the horse figurine moving up and down without your power. You can't make it go faster or slower. You're just kind of along for the ride. And the carousel is constantly moving in a circle forever. It just kind of keeps going no matter what. And so she's drawing on those parts of the metaphor without having to articulate them, without having to talk about some of those out of control aspects. And then we see her avatar here going from, mixed states where it's hard to hold on and everything is moving around too fast and you're not sure, if you're even on the horse anymore, to depression where she's curled up underneath the horse. And some of these avatars are smiling and happy and some of them are not. And we can kind of see the feeling at the same time as we get this medical terminology affiliated with each of those sensations. And for me, this visual metaphor in this depiction is just so powerful because it balances these two versions of language in such an effective way. And it produces the effect where many readers can recognize in her explanation, her representation, their own experience of the medical diagnosis, whether or not the DSM language was able to kind of come through for them in the same way that it did for Forney. So I find that really, really powerful, really valuable. So those are just two examples, and I would love to open it up for questions, talk a little bit more openly. I apologize that we're a little bit over the time that I had hoped to open for questions, but I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What can we say together?
Thank you so much for that, Professor Krista. It was so wonderful. It was so comprehensive. I think that's what really struck me, because you began right from the beginning about the definitions and what graphic medicine meant, which is fairly new, like you said, and a lot of people might not be aware of it. And then you went into these very specificities. You covered so much ground. You covered about language and how medical language can escape you as a writer, as a reader, and how, like for example, in the case of Ali, how she uses humor to be able to talk about these really dark experiences of say, for example, having depression, and about how graphic format allows for this subjective experiences to, it gives a space for the subjective experiences to be told. And in some ways, it allows for the people to be seen, like people with mental illnesses to be seen, and also for the author to be seen. It's a double way experience of being seen both ways. And so I think it was wonderful. We can take a few questions, but maybe I'll start with a question and then I'll give them some time to think about and formulate their questions, if that's okay. Yes. Okay. So one of the questions that I did, I think maybe it might be more of a comment than a question, but it's something that you already mentioned a little bit. So about accessibility. So when it comes to mental illness, for example, or even any illnesses for that matter, medical care is not that accessible, right? The language is not accessible. On a financial ground, it's not accessible. Might be culturally, if there's a stigma, especially like, for example, in Indian context, where there's so much stigma around mental illness, the help is not accessible. So in conditions like that, I think graphic memoirs play a role, right? Because they are easily accessible than, say, medical care. For example, in the case of Ali's comics, it was available online as web comics. So anybody with an internet who type in the right keywords might have the access to that. So what do you have to say about accessibility and medical memoirs in graphic format?
I think you said it perfectly, Angel. I think that's exactly right. That's what's really important. I think that's part of what the graphic medicine community is trying to highlight, that there's so much about knowledge about mental health and mental wellness, but also mental illness that is really difficult to comprehend if you have a language barrier, if you have an education barrier, or if you're just not a person who talks like that. And that, doesn't have to be a formal, disability or a formal category. It can just be that doesn't make sense to you. And, we've probably all been in a situation where we're in a doctor's office and the doctor says, well, it's this, this, and this. And you have to say, wait, what does that mean? And some of us are culturally a bit more empowered to do that. And others of us are less able in those moments to speak up for ourselves and advocate. And what graphic medicine enables through this process of I think through the process of self-recognition, others would frame it differently, but for me, it's through self-recognition, that by seeing someone else experience this and become emboldened and ask different questions or explain things in a new way, I or someone else who's read this memoir can now go into a clinical scenario and have new thoughts, right? So it's not about overstepping, like now I know what I have and I don't need the doctor, but it's about having, like you said, access, having the accessibility to information that previously was very closed off and you could only access if you had the funding and the knowledge and the means and the confidence and the awareness and the cultural competence to access it through the formal channels. And if those of us who know some history of medicine know that medicine wasn't always that way either. So this is in the history of humans, it's not the only way to have medical knowledge circulated either. So it's a corrective to those changes as well, the professionalization of medicine and the commercialization of medicine. So graphic medicine pushes back in all those different directions. And you're really, really right to point that out.
Thank you so much. I think we can open up for questions. People can unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can drop a question in the chat box and I can read it out to Professor Krista.
Wonderful.
Okay, while people take some more time to formulate their questions, let me quickly jump in, if I may, using or perhaps abusing the privilege that I have as one of the organizers. So it was a wonderful talk, Krista, and it opened up all these, especially the way you started with this idea of idiosyncratic particular details forming a certain kind of universal identification. Made me think of these ideas of perhaps more recent ideas of the universal, which are more singular in nature, the idea of the singular universal, or to use that kind of Zizek'ian language, a concrete universal. So it was very interesting to sort of think about that idea of identification. I did have maybe a couple of points which are not exactly questions, but it'll be great if you could respond to them. They're more like reflections, possibly. So I was kind of wondering a little bit, especially with the second text, about the acceptation of medical terminology, because that's always been a very let's say, tricky area within narrative medicine. There's sometimes a subjective reaction against these diagnostic categories, and sometimes there is a strange kind of self-identification with those categories as well. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the diversity of responses that we see in perhaps graphic narratives, but perhaps more generally in medical narratives, in literary texts that deal with medical themes. But specifically graphic novels, I know that's what you work on. So I mean, of course, that it would be perfectly fine if you stick to that. But I was just kind of wondering if you could say a little bit more about sometimes this kind of, this idea of diagnosis as violence that we talk about within medical humanities, right? The other thing which I really found fascinating, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit ignorant about these books, but I found that dead fish metaphor absolutely fascinating. And the whole question of platitude, as you say, denialism, what does the depressed person want? Does the depressed person want some sort of a basic acknowledgement of the facticity of the situation, the fact that the fish is dead or the fishes are dead? I was just wondering, what would that do to the person? I mean, if the people would have all pointed out, instead of those platitudes, that, yeah, I mean, they're super dead, as you also read out from that section, right? So, I mean, I'm just wondering if you could speculatively think through what that kind of, response would produce as a kind of subjective effect on the depressed person, right? So these are the two things I wanted to say. I'm sorry if I went, too long on this.
No, that's great. Make sure I'm okay. I want to make sure I didn't mute myself. No, those are really, really thoughtful questions. Thank you so much, Arko. So the first question, the diagnosis as violence, is absolutely right. And that's super, super helpful to me. So thank you very much. I think you're exactly right. And the very cheap and easy answer to your question is that there are as many responses as there are memoirs, as there are humans, as there are bodies, right? And that's both the hard and the easy part of kind of making sort of the work that I'm doing now, is to try to find trends and to try to create categories. And honestly, the more I read, the more I see different nuances. So that's one of, to me, the fun things about graphic medicine. And, as comic studies matures and as graphic medicine matures as a field, we get to be more precise and we get to narrow and focus. I think a few years ago, most of the books were like, I swear it's a thing, I promise. And there are all these appeals to take it seriously, treat this as a true field to study. And I think we're in the scholarship I'm reading, we're moving enough past that, and we're getting to a point where we're able to know that it's a field, know that it's a thing, and really dig into the details. And so for my work, I'm happy to stand on the shoulders of giants and think about that next phase where we really get to say, okay, there are as many possible situations here, as many reactions to the moment of diagnosis as possible, right? Some celebratory, some that say, oh my gosh, I'm so relieved. I'm so grateful to have language for this thing. I thought it was just me. I thought I was alone. I'm so excited to have a community on one end. And then all the way in every detail and nuance to something more like Forney, where it's like that, there's stigma there. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be one of those people. I don't want that affiliated with me, or I don't want to lose that part of myself. Somewhere in the middle might be a resistance to the diagnosis, but a willingness to treatment, or a resistance to the treatment, even though they appreciate the language of the diagnosis, right? So there are all these different negotiations that we make because our individual experiences and the expressions of illness in our bodies and our lives is going to be different, significantly different. Tom Kauser helps me understand this a great deal, thinking about one person going to the grocery store with one condition might have different challenges than the next person having that same condition at the grocery store, right? So of course, our response to diagnosis, to treatment, all of those things would be different, and that shows up in the narrative. So to me, the notion of diagnosis as violence is valuable to take into account, and that has to fall on a scale. But the more narratives I look at, the more I see that diversity and that availability. And to me, I kind of go back to Angel's question, and I think the more we see, the more there is available, the more we acknowledge and we're aware that there isn't one way to react. You don't have to celebrate your diagnosis. You don't have to feel like you've been seen. You can be mad about it. You can say no at first. You can find a new doctor if that doctor didn't give it to you the right way. All of those things, the more we proliferate responses, the easier it becomes to be an empowered patient who knows how to react in the moment. So I think that's really important. I hope that answers or gets to your question a bit. And I think your question about how would, if somebody had the perfect reaction, right? The very perfect reaction. I sometimes think as a teacher, when we go to trainings, like a training on how to work with students in this situation, or how to improve your sensitivity to this situation, where people are always looking for that perfect way to respond, and there isn't a perfect way to respond. But yes, so if you come to someone and you say, yes, I'm a person with depression, I have depression, I am depressed, I'm super depressed, I need your support right now, and that person says, wow, that sucks, I still like you, or wow, your fish are, I'm so sorry that your fish are so dead. I think what Broche is trying to get us to understand is that response validates the condition without trying to solve the problem. for the person experiencing it, right? And in many cases, those very happy, cheerful, well-meaning people who don't experience the condition themselves don't have the answer. And even people who do experience the condition themselves don't necessarily have the answer for that person. And they're, just to speak to what I just was saying about the diagnosis of violence, they don't have the reaction for that person, right? The response that will work for that other person in their individual body. So as well-meaning, as kind, and as generous as they are, their compulsion to solve it or to resolve it for that person is less helpful in the way that Broche is framing it for us than just being with and making space and acknowledging and saying, I understand that this is hard, and I'm here, and you tell me what you would like. What can I do for you? And I think Broche's argument is that that would be more helpful. I do totally acknowledge that there are other folks in the world for whom the fish are always deadest before the dawn is exactly what they needed to hear. And so again, every narrative we hear, every narrative we read, it gives us another frame to continue thinking about how will I react, what's going on with me, how can I respond and be there and acknowledge and be kind to the people in my life when I learn a little bit more about this, when it comes up for me. Does that answer a little bit? No, we're a little bit past our marker here. I'm okay. I'm okay on time, but if others need to go, I totally understand if we need to cut it off.
If we have a last question, maybe from the floor, anyone, please feel free to unmute yourself. Angel, you have one? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can I ask another question? I'm so sorry I'm hogging other people's time. But I was just, something is sparked when you were answering Professor Orko's question. This might be a little nerdy on the other end of the graphic format itself. Like, for example, when we say the graphic format helps the patients or the readers feel seen, it's also because it's of the way that it's visualized, right? We were explaining how the generalizability and the specificity matters there. So I was just thinking the way they visualize, say, for example, the process of therapy itself, or affect, or how it affects the body, for instance, and the language that they use in these particular settings is also related to, in some sense, other things for the reader, like empathy and compassion, right? And like you were responding about the perfect response, and I've had people tell me that, compassion is radical. It is, maybe. So then, so how does all of this tie together? The way that the format helps to visualize these experiences, and how that generates this, I don't know, like this reparative, like feelings of empathy and compassion. So how does all of that tie together?
Yeah, that's the book, Angel. You got it. I'm working on it. I think that's exactly right. And so I focused in this talk on the language because I think the language is so powerful in medical discourse, right? The language is where a lot of the power in medical discourse comes from. And as you mentioned before, a lot of the gatekeeping and the sort of pushing folks out and the lack of access. So for me, the language is really vital. I'm also a literary studies scholar, so I start with the language often, sometimes too much. But I do appreciate the importance of the visual. And another sort of piece of this talk, one that I considered using for this event actually, is thinking about sort of the representations of empathy in the bodies and the reactions, both of therapists and of non-therapists, right? So if we go back to the panel of Broche's platitude folks, and Broche is a tough case in terms of reading body language, because she does draw in that really playful, childish style that I love so much, but it makes it hard to read finer details. And I think that works really well, but it also doesn't produce the kind of precision that you can say about their body language, right? But many of them are smiling, right? Many of them are cheerful. And so you can read them as not intending to be harmful. And you know that without even Broche saying it in her narration, right? Similarly, Forney, as much as she doesn't want to be bipolar, she loves her therapist. She changes therapists at different times, and she has sort of a journey with therapy throughout the book. She also has a follow-up. Her work is incredible, but seeing her in the therapy space we see her therapist's entire body and that entire body language. And we sometimes see the therapist face front. And so the reader is in the position of being the patient and looking at the therapist from the front. And then other times we watch as though we're watching on a movie screen and they're talking to each other and we're the observer, we're the fly on the wall. And so Forney gives us those different perspectives and she moves us through that. And that's some of the work I'm working on now, is how the visual produces depictions and representations of exactly what you mentioned, empathy and compassion. The visuals in these memoirs help us to understand the reactions that these comics artists are teaching us to have, even when they're not articulating. Hold your hand like this, say the words like this, be sure to have this facial expression. They're not teaching us that, but their visuals are showing us through positive and negative examples that some things work better than others. And I don't think that in every way, shape, or form a comics artist is teaching, right? So I want to not overstate how much they're trying to educate. Sometimes they're just telling a story and that's the story, right? But I also think that it's really informative and it's helpful to draw information. So I hope that's useful. Your question is spot on.
Thank you so much.
So we maybe consider one last question if there's any from the floor, from the digital floor, should I say? Anyone?
I'm now
please?
picturing like The Sims, a dance floor in The Sims or something.
Yeah, I mean, please feel free to unmute yourself or put a question in the chat box if you have one. Otherwise,
yeah, I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Yeah, perhaps we could draw this session to a close then. Thank you again. Thank you so much, Krista, for this wonderful talk. And because you did it in a very comprehensive way, as Angel said, it was, I'm sure, an eye-opener for also, interested students who may not really have done the deep dive into graphic medicine so far. So I'm sure it would be really valuable for those who would hopefully come back and watch it again or watch it on our YouTube channel when it becomes available. Thank you so much, Krista, for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions, and feel free to reach out anytime. I'm so grateful. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your evening.
You too. Bye-bye. Bye everyone. Bye.